The story came from a few pieces that I was kind of playing with. One story was an attempt to understand the kind of Japanese psyche and the events of that whole period between like 1936 to the end of the war. One was a short story about a young kid who was about 17, 18, who his girlfriend happened to be deaf, and they had this kind of interesting, weird little relationship. I also had a kind of little scene idea that I was working on, this conversation between a young girl who was terminally ill with cancer playing Operation with her older sister. And I kind of just sat down and had a little epiphany of want to try and kind of blend them in some odd way.
I was so moved, obviously, by the circumstances and, you know, what the characters were dealing with and all of that, but also just the way in which Jason articulated himself.
The thesis for me was that, you know, you're not the things that happen to you, you're just the person that they happen to.
You are not the victim of the events in your life, but the events of your life are the creation of what you perceive.
I didn't feel there were a lot of films that kind of captured the honesty of what I grew up seeing, my father being a pediatric oncologist. I really wanted to see it portrayed honestly, as I remember it.
They always tell me how brave I am after every needle and MRI and test. Makes me wonder how the non-brave kids act.
The point did actually come, you know, after us working together pretty intensively for a year and a half, where it was kind of ready to go out, and eventually it ended up at Imagine.
You know, as soon as it was sort of out there that we were really involved and really serious about it, really interesting directors began raising their hand. Among them was Gus Van Sant.
He happened to read it and just said he wanted to do it. From the acting to the costume design to just the look of the film, even the sound design, the music with Danny Elfman, just there were choices that were made that were able to be creatively distinctive.
The film originally was placed in Orono, Maine, and so going into kind of a research aspect of locations and the look of this small town, we were looking at structures and what city streets look like and those things, and then trying to find those looks in Portland. And then it went more along the lines of, well, why don't we just call it Portland, but we'll keep the whole spirit of the small town. So it could be Portland, but it's not downtown Portland, it's more of small town or the little smaller sections of the city itself.
Annabelle and Enoch live in this heightened reality almost. They're, you know, kind of a fantastical world of their own. And filming in Portland sort of is a really harsh contrast to this world that they live in, which I think is beautiful.
Danny Glicker, who did the costumes, is genuinely, he's brilliant. He's really brilliant. And he's worked with Gus before, so they have a great collaboration.
For me, the beautiful thing about this movie is that it's such an intimate collaboration with Gus and with the actors. What I'm interested in is exploring with the actors exactly what it is we want to express and how they need to feel in each sequence.
The suit was a giveaway. You're not supposed to wear black to these things anymore.
Why not?
Because it's a bummer.
I wanted to make sure that when we were exploring Enoch and we were exploring the way that he associated with the world through his clothing, the grief that he's trying to work through and the grief that he's expressing through the way that he presents himself to the world is something that is genuinely felt by the character.
Enoch is really into this idea of death, and he's stuck in it, and every aspect of his life is invested in this obsession and healing himself from his parents' death. And when you see these clothes, you can see that it's a very sort of meticulous adaptation of this obsession.
That's her.
Who?
That girl I was telling you about.
Why is she dressed like a boy?
She's not.
Annabelle is so much fun to design. You know, what's so nice about her is she has a really deep and powerful respect for the idea that life is a cycle and that life has a time limit. And she's an incredibly curious person, and she's an incredibly knowledgeable person, and I thought all these things were really fun things to explore in terms of how she presents herself in the clothing that she finds interesting.
It's not my best color. It's one of my mom's old dresses. It's a little big, but it should be okay, right?
A lot of her clothes are vintage pieces from the 20s, and a lot of them are vintage pieces from the 30s, and then a ton of stuff from the 60s. I really wanted to find a way to mix it all up because Annabelle understands how limited her time is. She wants every day to be special.
There's also a lot of symbolism in the jewelry that she wears. You know, there's mourning pendants that she wears to funeral, and then there's also a little clock which is stopped, and little tiny little details that Danny is just so clever about.
Enoch is this very black, this very intense aesthetic presence, and then Annabelle is very colorful, and it creates an aesthetic contrast which is also fulfilled by an emotional contrast.
Hiroshi is a really fascinating character to costume. We work very closely with experts in Japanese military garments. We then started working with these really amazing military uniform sources in Japan. And we were working with actual kamikaze uniforms from the 40s to make sure that everything that we created for him was absolutely accurate. And some of it is very unpolished. Things like the Japanese flag on his arm is hand sewn. You know, we spent an enormous amount of time and effort to make sure that his whole outfit had the exact amount of age and the exact amount of distress that it would have at the exact point of Hiroshi's death. One of the more interesting things is they run into a major confrontation with a group of thugs that Enoch has an incredibly intense history with. And the script had them dressed in one set of costumes, which was pretty traditional. And Gus came up with the concept for Lord of the Flies. And it was fun to imagine how these young kids, these teenagers, would put these costumes together. I could not be happier with the way that they turned out. They were a lot of fun to create those costumes.
Gus does this great thing where each time you do a scene, he does a silent take. The actors will do the scene, as they normally would, you know, with the blocking and all of that, but they don't speak.
Every single shot we did a silent take. It really frees it up in a lot of ways. Doing the silent take brings to light so much stuff that you don't realize or don't understand when you're sort of speaking over it.
He has learned that in the editing process, sometimes it's difficult to get sort of like the right response. So he did it so that it would be easier in terms of editing. But what it does in terms of performance is you get all these moments that kind of say so much more than even the dialogue can even express.
You know, I was sort of joking with Gus, and I was like, we could make a whole silent film. And I thought that was a great idea. I think it resonated with him. So there is a whole silent film basically around. You know, it was always sort of exciting to be able to do something kind of experimental. There's a lot of experiences in the film where they sort of talk about death and mortality and eternity and stuff like that. And they talk about it with humor and frankness.
So, how long?
3 months. So I understand if you don't want to.
A person can get a lot done in 3 months.
I thought it was really intelligent and smart and gave young adults a lot of credit for the complicated emotions and themes that they're dealing with in this story.
I wish I could do more, you know? Like, take you to the Galapagos or make it be spring or something.
You did enough.
Something that I really also hope that people take away from this film and the viewing of it is just the experience of falling in love for the first time, and kind of no matter what your future holds for you, really being able to be present with another person. You know, this is one person who's going to lose her life and another person who has experienced such tragedy and is afraid of moving forward, and yet what this movie captures is two people being totally present with one another. And I think for that reason, it's a valuable experience to kind of take away as an audience.